Okay, today we'll be talking about interconnections between acquisition and retrieval. Okay, the first section is learning as preparation for retrieval. So some important terms to keep in mind for this section. Recall is related to memory here, and this is when a participant or individual is required to generate an item from memory. So an example of querying this type of memory would be, what type of animal did you have as your first pet? Here you are simply generating this response from your internal memory. Compared to this, we have recognition, also related to memory. Here you have some item that you want to see if an individual remembers, and you show them this item and ask if they have ever seen it before. Another way of asking would be if they're familiar with it. An example here would be just, have you ever seen a bicycle like this one before? Context-dependent learning, this refers to the phenomena by which when we learn in a particular situation, we tend to be better at remembering items learned in that situation when we're tested in a similar situation, than when we're tested in a situation that is different from where we learned. Finally, you have this concept of context reinstatement. This refers to the idea that if we learn material in a specific environment and are then tested on it in a different environment, we can often reap the benefits of being tested in a similar environment only by imagining what it was like to be in the situation in which we learned the material in the first place. Okay, let's look at an example, or a couple of examples, I suppose, of context-dependent learning. Here they took a series of scuba divers and they were given a list of words to remember. Half of those scuba divers learned that list on land and the other half learned that list underwater. After they had all learned this list of words, they were then tested, and again something similar happened, whereby half were tested on land and half were tested underwater. This resulted in a quarter of people learning on land and being tested on land, another quarter learning on land, being tested underwater, another quarter learning underwater and being tested underwater, while the remaining quarter was learned underwater and then were tested on land. So here's what happened. Just thinking about those at first who studied on land, you can see that for them, the ones who were then tested on land did better than those who were tested underwater. And we see the opposite pattern for those who studied underwater. This time, the ones who were then subsequently tested on land did worse than the ones who were tested underwater. So what we can take from this is it's not something as simple as simply learning a set of words, but rather the context in which we learn seems to have some impact on how well we will remember. They have found similar findings for when you're asked to learn in quiet or noisy rooms. So in this case, subjects were asked to read a passage in either a noisy or a quiet room, and then they were asked questions about that passage they had just read, and they were asked those questions also in a noisy or quiet room. And so here in this table, you can see that when they learned in a noisy room and were tested in a noisy room, 62% of responses were correct, while when they learned in a noisy room but were tested in a quiet room, only 46% of responses were correct. You see this opposite pattern for when they learned in a quiet room and were tested in a quiet room, 67% of responses were correct, while only 54% of responses were correct when they learned in a quiet room and were then tested in a noisy one. Okay, so there was also another variant of this design, and here participants were asked to think about the room in which they had learned before they were given the test. When they were asked to think about what the room was like, it had to do with things like what did it look like and how it made them feel. So once they had engaged in this activity, they actually ended up performing just as well as people who were tested in rooms similar to the environment in which they learned. So this is context reinstatement that we talked about on the previous slide. Okay, a little bit about encoding specificity. Imagine you're asked to remember a certain word. Here the target word to remember is piano, and you are presented with one of the following. Either the person lifted the piano or the person tuned the piano. Let's say afterwards, to help you remember, you're given one of the following clues. something heavy, or something with a nice sound. Do you think the clues would make a difference in which times or for which sentences people would remember the word piano at a higher frequency? Turns out it does make a difference. So encoding specificity refers to the idea that when learning, the tendency to encode into memory both the materials to be learned and also some amount of the context of those materials. Basically, you can think about this as when those scuba divers were learning that list of words underwater, they were also simultaneously remembering aspects of their environment. So when they were in that environment, they were more likely to remember those words because those words are now associated with aspects of that environment. In terms of this example here, when the person lifted the piano, one is cued to think about how heavy pianos are. Thus, the clue something is heavy tends to activate our recollection of that statement and thus the word piano, because both of those two things are ultimately related. The converse happens for when the statement was the person tuned the piano. Here the clue something heavy actually does not help us at all, and in turn the clue something with a nice sound actually improves the rate of memory. It has to do with the nice sound being related, or it is specific to when we are tuning pianos. So this just is kind of what I said of, as a result, these materials will be more readily recognized as familiar if the materials appear again in a similar context than if presented in a dissimilar context. Here's a couple of brain scans. So here the bottom row is looking at when people are actually perceiving some external material, and the top row is indicating brain scans for when they're asked to recall those same images or auditory stimuli that they were witnessing at that time. Now, while you can see that the much greater activation, of course, when you're actually witnessing something as opposed to recalling it, just more sensory processing involved because the stimulus is right in front of you, but you will see that there is an overlap of situation or neural regions when you're actually perceiving something versus when you were, in this case, looking at it. Again, in this case, they're remembering some type of visual image, while here they were actually looking at said image. And here, most likely, they were listening to some type of sound while they were remembering that type of sound. Now, yes, there seems to be less activation when you're remembering something. That's not really what we're going to spend much time talking about here. Rather, what's much more important is that areas that are lit up when you are actually processing the various stimuli are similar to the ones that are active when you are trying to remember it. Thus, if through some external stimulus you activate regions that are close or overlapping with the item you are trying to remember, it makes it that much more likely that you will remember that item. Okay, now let's talk about memory as a network. So oftentimes memory can be thought of as a vast network of ideas where the ideas are ultimately nodes and those are linked together by associations. Before we delve into this a little bit more deeply, here are some terms that are good to know before thinking about memory in this way. First is a node. A node would be considered a basic unit of processing, and it generally represents a single concept. So for example, here a concept could be butter, could also be dog or brown or family or any such thing. An association is a link between two nodes. While theoretically you could have links between multiple nodes, generally when we conceptualize such networks, we generally make only single links between any two given nodes. Of course, there can be more than two nodes connected in a network. The activation level refers to the level of activation that a node has. So you can think of this in an analogous way with how neurons get activated. As the activation level of a neuron or a node increases, they become more likely to fire. In regard to that, there is response thresholds, and this just refers to the activation required by a node before it will pass activation on to other nodes. For example, if a node has a response threshold of 5, it will need to continue to get input from other nodes until its activation has reached that level of 5, completely arbitrary in this case, at which point it will then pass on its activation to whatever other nodes it is then connected to. Finally, we have decay. Decay refers to the rate at which the activation level of a node will continue to decrease over time if it is not getting activation from other nodes. Just a note here on and talking between nodes and neurons. A lot of times we have modeled nodes to represent or be similar to a neuron, but there are not neurons for concepts like butter in your brain. Rather, it's probably a collection of thousands, if not millions of them that ultimately let you do this. When we draw out nodes in the manner that I'm going to show you on the next slide, we're generally inferring that there's a large population of neurons responsible for any given node. So here are a couple of diagrams just to give you an idea of what it looks like or how people tend to draw such diagrams. Here are simply two nodes that are just connected by a single association. Please note that the line between them doesn't have any arrows on it. Thus, it is possible that activation could flow from A to B or from B to A. Here we have three nodes connected together. So here is the case that you have two nodes, A and B, both connected to node C. Here, A and B can pass 1 unit of activation per time cycle to C, and C has a response threshold of 1. Thus, if A is currently active and passing 1 unit of activation to C, that will result in C becoming active and passing on its information to whatever is down the line. Just as if B is activated while A is not, it still passes 1 unit of activation to C, and that results in C becoming activated and passing activation on down the line. It is possible that both A and B are active, resulting in an activation level of C being at 2. That meets its response threshold, and it will again pass on activation. Here we have ultimately something that is exactly similar, except that C now requires an activation level of 2. So here the only way in which C will be able to pass on activation to whatever it is connected to downstream will be if both nodes A and B, sorry, I pointed at those in the opposite time of how I said it, will need to be active and both pass on their 1 unit of activation to C, and they'll have to do it at the same time such that C reaches the activation threshold of 2 required for it to then fire. Please note that all of these are just static 1 instance snapshots of how it could be. This next one, referring to decay, actually has to do with time passing while a network is active. So here we're just looking at that original diagram again, and imagine that node A could pass 1 unit of activation every second to node B, and node B has an activation threshold of 2, meaning it needs 2 pieces of input, or 2 activation points as I've written up here in these little arrows, in order to become active and pass on information. Node B also has a decay rate of 4 seconds, meaning that it loses 0.5 activation points every second. Thus, if A passes 1 activation point every second, it will build up enough activation for B to fire. Right? So basically, in the first second, A fires off 1 point here, leading to B being activated by 1 point. Over the second that A is recharging, B has now lost 0.5 of those points, right? That's how much it loses every second. Upon which point A then fires again, resulting in B having an activation of 1.5. Over the second that A is again recharging, B loses half an activation point, resulting in it being at 1 now. A fires for the third time, giving another point of activation to B, resulting in its activation threshold reaching 2. Thus, it then is able to pass activation on to whatever it is then connected to. A little thought question here for you is, well, would B ever fire if A fires at a rate of once every 2 seconds? Now let's talk a little bit about retrieval cues. Retrieval cues can be referred to as hints in common day language, and so why is it that they help us remember? Specifically, this is a question given by your book. Why, for example, do we draw a blank when asked for the capital capital of South Dakota. I don't know about you, but I definitely drew a blank here. And then all of a sudden, one can remember it when told to think also of men's names. In this case, this cue did not help me at all, but perhaps for you this is different. So here you can see that we have two primary nodes, a node representing South Dakota, and it is connected to several pieces of information about that node, ultimately each their own node. So South Dakota is connected to the node of one of the states, thus we know it is a state. It is also connected to the node in the Midwest. It is also connected to the node close to Canada, and it is connected to Pierre, which turns out to be the capital of South Dakota. Who knew? Let's say South Dakota receives a certain degree of activation, right? That was when you were asked about the capital of South Dakota, this unit now gets some activation. It then passes activation to each of the other nodes it's connected to, and the hope is that it will pass enough activation to the Pierre node for that to then become active and us to remember that in fact the capital of South Dakota is Pierre. That being said, it is possible that Pierre will not get enough activation to reach its threshold and thus pass on activation, and we will struggle to remember what the capital in fact was. Then we're given the hint of thinking about men's names. In this case, the men's names unit or node gets activated, which is then connected to a bunch of other names like Fred, Jacob, Solomon, Louis, Tran, and Pierre. Now, Pierre, the node, is receiving activation from both South Dakota and from a man's names. This now doubling of activation might bring the Pierre node up to its response threshold and thus allow it to fire and pass on activation. Another way of talking about that would be that once it has reached its response threshold, it is more likely to be remembered. Ultimately, this is how most hints help, and why sometimes when you think you have a really good hint and you tell it to a close friend when you're playing some type of guessing game and they just look at you blankly, it is because your network and the nodes that you have within it and how they are connected is connected differently than your friend, who is now looking at you somewhat like an alien because your hint did not help them at all. Going back to the idea of context reinstatement, so remember that the idea here is that it is true that when we're in a situation and we learn some material and then we're tested in the same situation, we tend to do better than if we're tested in a different situation. It is not often the case that we have the luxury of being tested in exactly the same places we've learned, even though now that much of this is online and wherever you happen to be when you're listening to this, perhaps that's now a little bit different. Context reinstatement referred to the idea that all I have to do, now being in a different situation where I'm being tested, is think back on how I felt and what it was like to be in that environment where I in fact first learned whatever it is I'm now being tested on. You can see a very similar type of structure. Here you have just general thoughts about the list you're being asked to remember, right? Go back to the scuba diver example. And so here are some of the words that are on the list: home, city, and nose. Here maybe they have the idea or thought that they learned it yesterday and also thought it was a pretty goofy task, which makes sense if you're a scuba diver and someone asks you to go swim down to the bottom of a pool or something and learn a list of words. Now, when you're trying to recall that list of words, let's say you also spend some time about thinking about being underwater. Now, you might have some thoughts that were similar to those you had perceiving the water around you when you were underwater learning that list. Things like cold or looks blue and noise of breathing. But now also you have tied certain aspects of those thoughts being underwater to the words that you were learning while you were underwater. This is just simple associations from doing something in a certain type of context. Now it's possible that while home and city could have been or received enough activation just from general thoughts about the list, by thinking about being underwater, not only do you strengthen the activation of those two nodes, but maybe you also now pass on enough activation to the word nose node that it too reaches its response threshold. This is ultimately how, at least looking at memory as a network, allows us to explain phenomena like context reinstatement. Another piece of evidence for this type of association network in the brain, or not identical to this at least, but conceptualized as we have been in thinking of a memory system as a network, here there is a task in which pairs of letter sequences are presented to participants. Sometimes those letter sequences make words and sometimes they don't. And the task of the participant in this case is to respond yes, probably by pushing one of the keys on a keyboard, to respond yes if both of those letter strings are in fact words. So in this case, that would be similar to lake and shoe. And they would respond no if either one or both of those words were nonsensical sequences like blar, and in this case phone is a real word, but blar is presumably not, and thus they would select no. Now, would you expect participants to respond differently to the word pair bread and butter versus book and shoe? Well, I'm sure at this point you're like, of course they will, because whenever I ask questions like this, there's mostly a difference, and this is not going to be different. But why would there be a difference? Well, think a little bit too how that network is set up. So it turns out that when the first word primes the second, by that we just mean that bread oftentimes will make the activation or recognition of the word butter more quick or more fast or more readily available to us. This has to do because the association between bread and butter is very strong. This is why we can use the word bread to prime the word butter. You see that this is actually what happens. So it could be here, imagine yourself in this position. The person is reading the word bread. This is now being recognized. The word bread reached activation threshold, hence you're aware of it, and it is now passing activation to other nodes to which it is connected to, presumably butter being one of those. Now, imagine there's no priming, or now in this case, book versus shoe. And here, when you're reading the word book, while it is reaching its response threshold, so you can be aware of it, you shift your attention to the next word, presumably book is not in any significant way tied to the word shoe, and thus you have to lift the activation of shoe basically from baseline, and you do not get any benefit from reading the first word first. Hence, there was no priming. Here you can see that there's almost 100 millisecond difference in people's ability to respond to whether both words are words or not. Remember, right? They're not talking about whether they're related or not, simply responding yes or no to whether both words are words. But they are able to respond up to 100 milliseconds faster when those two words are related. Think back to networks, right? It is possible that you could just simply read the two words. Obviously, that's possible. People respond quite quickly to such things, but you are able to respond faster because now, not only after having read the word bread and moving your attention to butter where you're also reading it, you have to lift the activation of the butter node less because it already had some activation from its associated node bread. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about different forms of memory testing. So again, important terms. So recall and recognition we talked about earlier. Recall is when you're generating an item from your memory. Recognition is when you are being shown some type of item and being asked to recall, not recall, but recognize whether you have seen it before or not. So source memory refers to a form of memory that enables a person to recollect the episode in which learning took place or the time and place in which a particular stimulus was encountered. Ultimately, this is just a longer-winded way of saying that you know where it is that your memory is from. So if there's a smell of a very particular cookie that your friend cooked for you and you can remember the kitchen in which they baked those cookies for you and the time of day and what year and month it was, you probably have very good intact source memory. Familiarity is the subjective feeling that one has encountered a stimulus before, and another way of talking about this in terms of priming, for example, would be the objective fact that one has indeed encountered a stimulus before and is now in some way influenced by that encounter, whether or not one recalls that encounter or feels that the stimulus is familiar. So this would be an example of bread and butter in that previous slide, where now one is actually biased by the first stimulus that they get, and it is changing how they respond to the second one. Now, it is possible to have one without the other, so familiarity without source memory is very common. The most often way that we talk about this is something like, I've seen that person before, but for the life of me cannot remember where. Now, it doesn't have to be a person. This happens with all kinds of things. Like, I know that perfume from somewhere, but I could never tell you where I know it from. Now, the converse is much more rare. It is relatively infrequent to have complete source memory without any type of familiarity, and generally is the result of some kind of neurological damage. So Capgras syndrome we've talked about before, and it has to do with when people lose a sense of familiarity with objects or people that they're very familiar with. And oftentimes they will freak out and be convinced that those people have been replaced by imposters. So for example, a person suffering from Capgras syndrome might accuse their sibling or parents of being alien imposters or androids or simply just fakes because they have no sense of familiarity with this person, even though they objectively know who they are, and that disconnect can actually cause quite a degree of stress. When it comes to tests about memory, there are two different types. We have direct memory testing. This is where one simply asks participants whether they can recall a list of items or some episode from their past. It allows us to probe explicit memories or memories that participants have direct access to. In contrast to this, there's indirect memory testing, and this is a form of testing memory in which one does not actually ask a participant about what they remember, but rather you give them some items to be remembered, not telling them that they need to remember it, mind you, sometimes with an innocuous task like, will you spell check these words, or think about how these shapes are related, or some such thing. And then you give them some other task in which those items are also involved, and you look at how their performance with those items is different than with items they have not been exposed to before. Looking at priming differences, like how we talked about with the response rate differences with being given the word pair bread and butter versus the word pair book and shoe. That is a form of priming and is also a form that allows us to have indirect memory tests. So an example to just illustrate the difference between these two and how I would approach going about it in both forms. Let's say I wanted to see if one is exposed to the word clatter. Let's say I give you a list of words and ask you to spell check them. After I've done that and you have now spell checked all the words, I just ask you to write down all the words you can remember from that list you just spell checked. That would be a form of direct memory testing. Maybe though, instead of asking you what words you remember, I ask you to complete the following word, and I give you CLA to start, and you can complete it however you want. And I look at what the difference is, or the likelihood that you will complete that word as clatter, which matches a word that you've already seen while you were spell checking, versus words that you have not previously seen that could also potentially complete other such words. Okay, with that, let's talk a little bit about implicit memory. So the first part that we'll talk about in regards to implicit memory is this concept of false fame. So just imagine yourselves along for the ride. Here, participants were given a set of names and they were told that their pronunciation was being tested. So basically you're given a list of names and you're told to say each one out loud to see how well you can pronounce those names. Then participants were asked to rate another set of names in terms of how famous those names were, or how famous are the people to whom those names correspond. And this list had some very famous people in it, some somewhat famous people, and some totally fictitious names. Now, the difference here happens with half the participants who went through both of these tasks, they had them immediately following each other, such that For half the participants, after they did the pronunciation task, they immediately afterwards completed the fame task. While for the other half, they completed the pronunciation task and then were given a 24-hour delay before they were given the set of names in which they were asked about how famous those names were. Now, it turns out that in the delay condition, participants rated names that appeared in both lists as being more famous than did participants who rated how famous those names were directly after the pronunciation task. So, what's going on here? Well, it's likely that the source memory degraded over that 24-hour period while the familiarity remained. Now, what does this mean? Well, think about yourself in this situation. You've just been given a list of names and been asked to pronounce them, and then you're given another list of names immediately after and asked to rate how famous they are. And you come across a name that feels a little bit familiar, and well, if you think about why it feels familiar, it's not that hard to imagine that you just came across that word previously in the pronunciation test, and thus are not likely to change how famous or not you think that person is, and rather attribute that familiarity to having seen that name just a moment ago. Now, when you're in that delay condition, though, a full 24 hours have passed, and the chances are you do not exactly remember which names were on that pronunciation list. And so when you come across that name, you might still have a sense of familiarity for it, having seen it before, but not being consciously aware of having seen it. And this familiarity then might be incorrectly attributed to that name being famous. After all, we tend to hear names that are famous slightly more, and so if a name is kind of familiar and we don't really know them, probably a famous person. See? Ultimately, that is this conclusion of thus we might attribute that familiarity to the fame of a name. The illusion of truth is another form of implicit memory. So here's just a question to think about. But have you ever wondered why so many people say that breakfast is the most important meal of the day? Well, it turns out that the more one is exposed to statements, especially ambiguous ones like breakfast is the most important meal of the day, the more one will believe that it is true. This effect is called the illusory truth effect. And while this is not the only reason that we say that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, in fact, if you really want to look at it, from what I understand, Freud's nephew was actually hired by a canning company to be able to sell more cans, and so got a group of doctors to say that bacon as part of breakfast is a healthy part of the day and a required or most important meal of the day. And because bacon got used in it a lot, bacon was being canned at the time, so the canning company sold a bunch more cans, and that was a little bit after World War II, and ever since then we do really think that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Now, unfortunately, this pattern even emerges when people are told that certain statements are false at the time that they are encoding these statements. In one variant of such a study, they had statements that were presented as being made by either men or women, and they were told that statements made by men were false and statements made by women were true. So examples of this would be Frank Foster, presumably a man's name, says that mice can run an average of 4 miles an hour, and Gail Logan, presumably a woman in this case, says that crocodiles sleep with their eyes open. At later points in time, when asked to determine whether these sentences without the names now were in fact true or false, people rated statements they had come across as more true in equal proportions, regardless of whether those statements has been made by men or women. Even though they were told half of the statements were incorrect at the time they were witnessing them, they still rated them as more true in a subsequent test when they were exposed to those statements again. Now, real-life implications of this are pretty drastic. One, well, people eat a lot of breakfast, and, well, I love breakfast, so I won't go after that too much. But think about how news articles and media headlines oftentimes are. They portray certain governors or presidents as being crooks or noble, and however that statement might be, ultimately they tend to be relatively ambiguous because we don't really have great metrics to compare people's moral fiber. And thus, the more often we're exposed to certain statements in either direction, positive or negative, the more and more we're exposed to them, the more likely we are to believe that they are true, even if there's no basis behind them. Now, please remember, it is important to note that this works with ambiguous statements. If there's something that is completely unambiguous, like 2 plus 2 is equal to 7, you know that that is incorrect and there is no ambiguity about it. So no matter how many times I say 2 plus 2 is 7, you are unlikely to believe it more. That being said, if there is something that one does not know much about, like the governor of North Dakota is actually a very, very friendly man, well, how do you know? I, in fact, don't even know if the governor of North Dakota is, in fact, a man. Maybe, but who knows? The chances are, if I tomorrow ask you about whether it's true or not that the mayor or governor of North Dakota is a man, you will rate it as a little bit more true than you would have today. If you listen to me say that to you over and over, randomly speaking over the space of a month, let's say, chances are you would rate it as being even more true without there being any evidence really one way or another. So, source confusion, this refers to a memory error in which one misremembers where a bit of information was learned or where a particular stimulus was encountered last. So an example of a study to illustrate this is a group of psychologists got together and in front of participants they staged a crime. Now, 2 or 3 days after this staged crime, they went and showed these participants a group of mugshots. Another 4 or 5 days later, they came back and showed a lineup to those participants and asked people to pull a face out of that lineup indicating who was guilty in that original staged crime. Now, almost 30% of people selected a face from the lineup that was in the mugshots earlier but was not at the staged crime. What is happening here? Ultimately, what is happening is the staged crime happened, followed by being shown mugshots, and both of those are related items for this memory, but they happened at different times. Now, our brains don't have, well, high-resolution atomic clocks in them that we can timestamp everything like modern-day photographs, and so it is easy for those two memories to become muddled, such that it is possible that the memory I have of the staged crime, that I don't know is staged, and the memory I have of mugshots now gets intermixed with each other, such that I put one of the faces that was in the mugshots in my memory of the staged crime. Thus, when I'm shown a lineup later, more likely to pull that name out of a crowd. Now, this is not happening consciously, right? You're not thinking about, oh, let me go edit thy memory of the staged crime. No, that's not how it's happening. Most of this is completely unconscious processing. And two, it's not happening to everybody, right? Only 30% of people did happen to that are making this confusion. And while this might seem like a small number to you, please think about the fact that there's more than 1 million people in prison in this country, and a lot of them get sent to prison based on eyewitness testimony. And if that eyewitness testimony is at any point delayed after that crime actually happened, a non-trivial amount of people are going to be selecting faces that they find more familiar, not necessarily faces that they saw at the actual crime. And 30% of 1 million people is a lot of people. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the theoretical treatments of implicit memory. So, processing and sensing fluencies. Processing fluency refers to the efficiency of a processing pathway. The higher that fluency, the more easily information is able to flow through it. So that example earlier, bread and butter, is an instance of two things that have very high processing fluency between them, right? So the idea that I can just say bread and you're likely to think of butter shows that there's very high processing fluency there, much less than if I say caterpillar and expect you to think coffee mug. Processing pathways simply refer to the paths or connections that exist between different concepts. This is analogous to the idea of association pathways earlier. Sensing fluency is our ability to detect that processing fluency. So just as you are able to determine that 2 plus 2 is easy and 17 times 19 is hard, probably, so too are we able to detect how easy or difficult our processing was. And, well, a note on that. So some people think that it's not actually us processing our own processing, but rather we have some expectations of how easy it will be, and then it is either easy or difficult. And then the discrepancy between those two is ultimately what we talk about when we are talking about sensing fluency. Now, a stimulus that is easy to process, i.e. that has high processing fluency, is ultimately experienced as something that rings a bell, especially if you do not know exactly where you know it from. A lot of times we actually spell like this. You don't often know the exact combination of letters to make up a word, and you can write it down and ask yourself if it looks right, and oftentimes if it's spelled correctly, it will look right. Not always, though. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this idea of familiarity. So, evidence suggests that a stimulus will feel familiar if the following 5 criteria are met. 1, you have encountered it before. 2, because of that prior exposure, you are faster and more efficient in processing the stimulus. Remember thinking about repetition priming. If you've been shown the same word over and over, you will be more quick to respond to that word. Then 3, we detect that fluency, that it wasn't that hard as I expected it to be, right? You're reading this word, you've seen it a bunch of times, and all of a sudden it's just really, really easy to read because you've read it a bunch of times before. Another way of thinking about that would be all of the units involved in decoding and processing that visual stimulus are still a little bit lit up or have some residual activation from the previous instance of reading that word, so when you read it again, less work is required to activate all of those nodes. Now, once you've detected this fluency, we try and figure out why it's special, right? Because while we can detect that it was easier to process than we expected, we don't always know why. Remember, I said it's more common for us to have familiarity without a source memory. Finally, we draw a conclusion about when and where we encountered this stimulus. Right, so now let's go back to that example when I had people rate names for pronunciation and then give a test about how famous they were. For those who were given the test immediately after the pronunciation task, they drew the conclusion that the stimulus was familiar because it was, in fact, something they had just seen before. For those who were given the famed test up to 24 hours afterwards, for them their conclusion, while possibly I saw that on the list before, might now in fact be that that name is just more famous because they feel familiar, they've detected that fluency, but don't actually know why that stimulus is special because they no longer remember the names on that list. So here's just a nice table that is in your book that illustrates this idea, right? We have some exposure to a stimulus, which is our step 1. You practice it in perceiving. This just means that the units involved in decoding it are activated, and that series of activation makes them more likely to be activated in the future. That is ultimately what we detect as fluency, and it is then, if high in fluency, registered as special. We then attribute that fluency or special attribute to some prior event, and we have now familiarity. Of course, you can trick this system by manipulating our perceptions of processing fluency. So let's say that I give you a list of words, and so out of those words, the 4th word, I make it just much clearer on the screen. Well, let's say beyond the threshold of being able to perceive it, such that all the others are slightly fuzzy while that one is just much more crisp. It actually turns out that when you present people with stimuli in this way, it tricks their system into thinking it's more familiar. The system is now attuned to the greater difficulty needed to decode those fuzzy stimuli, so when the slightly more clear stimulus is presented and the processing was easier than we expected, right? The fluency was not as hard as we thought it was going to be, you get the same effect of that stimulus getting registered as special. One makes up an attribution because there is no true attribution, and that's something we're very, very good at. And then you again have that sense of familiarity, even though you never saw that thing before. This is just a note about when it changes in the opposite direction. So just think about for a second, what would happen to the processing fluency associated with the face of a friend that you see fairly often right after they had gotten their haircut? Chances are that it will become slightly more difficult to process their face because their face is now different than we remember, and different components need to be activated in order to accurately decode their face. And if they are subtle enough, the change in processing fluency, we will not actually detect exactly what that difference is, but we will have the feeling that something is new or different. And what we're actually detecting is not that there is something different on the face per se, but rather it took more processing power to decode their face than we expected it to take. And that ultimately elicits this feeling of there is something different here, and I can't quite put my finger on it. So here we just have a hierarchy of the different types of memory. You can find this in your book. Under the big hoopla of memory itself, we have explicit memory and implicit memory. Explicit memory refers to memories that we can ask about. It is something someone can self-report on, and generally can then be further subdivided into episodic memory, memories of specific events in your life. For example, what did you do the day before your 16th birthday? Versus semantic memory, this refers to memory of just general knowledge that's not really tied to anything in particular in your past. For example, grass is green. It is a piece of semantic memory I have, but is not really related to my past in any way. Contrasting, like I said, with explicit memory, we have implicit memory, and we can really only get at this with indirect tests. So the one we've talked about primarily here is priming. So this ultimately refers to changes in our perception or beliefs caused by previous experience. Right? The previous instances of encountering some stimuli have left residual activation in our networks, and that residual activation changes how we will behave in novel situations. That residual activation is a form of implicit memory. Other forms of implicit memory are procedural knowledge. This is knowledge about how to do something. It's knowledge, for example, of how to drive a car. You can get into a car and simply start driving now, then don't actually have to think about how to drive or how you know about driving or when you learn to drive. You simply get in and drive. That is procedural memory. Perceptual learning has to do with recalibration of perceptual systems as the result of experience. You could think about this as getting better and better depth perception as you practiced. Not really something you actively and consciously think about, you simply improve the more and more practice you have. Now, yes, I'm sure many of you have thought to yourselves, I'm no good at hand-eye coordination or some folly like that. And while it's possible that currently you have objectively bad hand-eye coordination, that does not mean it's not something you can practice. The more and more you actively practice your hand-eye coordination systems, the better and better you will get at hand-eye coordination. Again, not something you can actively probe about what is the current status of that coordination, but rather that is something that falls under this idea of perceptual learning. The last form of implicit memory is classical conditioning, and this refers to the pairing of two types of stimuli. Oftentimes you'll hear this talked about in regard to Skinner, where Skinner taught pigeons to push various buttons and rats to do various tasks based on pairing those activities with certain types of rewards. A lot of times you will see that even for humans at any given day, classical conditioning is something that applies to us on our whole lives, really. Many times we learn to associate some things as being good and some things as being bad simply by being exposed to them in different ways. A very simple way of that, or example of this, would be comfort food for different people across the planet. Not everybody thinks a fluffy omelet with some home fries is a very comforting meal. In fact, in many different places of the world, what constitutes comfort food is very, very different. In many cases, what it is that derives that comfort food is a food that we have been exposed to many times and exposed to that food in situations that made us feel comfortable. If you think back to what your comfort foods are, chances are you have eaten that food many a time in your past with people you really like, in places you felt comfortable. That association is ultimately what makes comfort food comforting. It is classical conditioning. Finally, couldn't get away with a lecture on memory without talking a little bit about amnesia. So, some important terms to keep track of here. Amnesia refers to the loss of memory. Retrograde amnesia is the loss of memories before some event, specifically or most often the event that caused the amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is the disruption of memory experiences after the onset of amnesia. Generally this results in the inability to form new memories of a certain type. It is important to note that this is not a zero-sum game, and it is impossible to have both forms of amnesia. A little bit about memory disruption. You could have episodic disruption or semantic disruption. In episodic disruption, you are ultimately able to identify things or produce facts. So I could say that's a lamp, or say that an apple weighs approximately 100 grams. I'm able to recall certain events that have happened to me, but I will most likely do these in a very impersonal way without any kind of feeling of attachment or emotion related to those events. If I'm asked to recall what certain events in my own past felt like, I would be unable to do this if I'm suffering from episodic memory disruption. You see the opposite pattern when it comes to semantic disruption. Here people are unable to identify common things such as a vase or a cup. They're unable to recall general facts and trivia, like the weight of the sun, I think, is 1.9 times 10 to the power 30 or something crazy like that. But they are, however, able to recall personal stories about their life, and often do so with vivid detail, and express many of the emotions and feelings they were having when they had that event. Okay, also got to talk a little bit about HM, probably one of the most famous people in psychology. So HM suffered from very, very severe anterograde amnesia. Ultimately was not able to create any new memories after the surgery that was meant to cure him of epilepsy. On the upside, I suppose, at least it did cure him of epilepsy. So here in this picture here, you can see a normal patient has a bunch of material, right? And not so much over here. So when they went in to cut out a little bit of the brain region that was thought to be driving the epileptic seizures in HM, they actually cut out a whole bunch more of the brain of HM. And what that turned out to be was huge portions of his hippocampus, and that is what is currently believed to have caused the anterograde amnesia. Now, HM, when you're talking to this person in a room, could actually hold a fairly normal conversation, as weird as that sounds. But that was only the case so long as you did not interrupt him or leave the room for a few minutes. If you were to do those things, then when you tried to start up the conversation again, HM, presumably having never met you before the amnesia event happened, would have no memory of who you are or any conversation you just had, and you'd have to start all over again. Now, another place we see this is with severe alcoholics who suffer from something called Korsakoff syndrome. So Korsakoff syndrome is, like I said, very common in severe alcoholics, and it results from a severe B1 vitamin deficiency. In this case, you ultimately get patients who show symptoms remarkably similar to people with severe anterograde amnesia, ultimately such that they are no longer able to form new memories. Now, it can be treated if caught early enough. A lot of times it's treated with simply giving people a high dose of thiamine or vitamin B1. If it is not, I believe sometimes the results can be permanent, such that some cases that are very, very severe, there are patients who have been hospitalized for years and years, and when asked, believe that they only just checked in. A little bit about types of memory that people with anterograde amnesia actually are able to form, which is kind of a strange thing to think about, because I just said that anterograde amnesia is the inability or disruption of creating memories. it turns out that that seems to disrupt our more explicit memory forms, but our implicit memory forms seem to remain somewhat intact. So in 1911, a woman with Korsakoff syndrome was introduced to a doctor, and that doctor had a pin in his hand when he shook hands with her, right? Such that that pin was pointing out, so when he shook hands with her, it pricked her hand. You could be asking yourself about the ethics of that time, but in 1911, World War I hadn't yet happened, and ethics were very different then. The next day, right before the handshake of when this woman was again being introduced to the doctor, she withdrew her hand and refused to shake the hand of the doctor. Now, when asked about this, no memory of ever meeting that doctor before, right? She cannot form those explicit memories. And weirdly enough, she's actually reported to have said, sometimes pins are hidden in people's hands. Now, when probed about this, no idea that it happened, no idea that it poked her hand, never had any memory of meeting this doctor, but felt incredibly uneasy when being asked to shake the hand of this doctor. Now, that is just a trip if you're trying to understand these kind of things, because you're dealing with someone who can't seem to form new memories, and all of a sudden they just formed a new memory. And this has been repeated in other and more ethical ways, and it's been shown to be actually a relatively reliable effect, especially in people with Korsakoff syndrome. So it does raise the notion that our explicit and implicit memory systems could actually operate independently. I mean, even there's probably a large degree of divide, because when I just talked a couple slides ago about the differences between semantic and episodic memory interruptions, those are ultimately operating on two of the different subheadings of explicit memory. Okay, finally, the converse. Can we have explicit memory without implicit memory? Now, maybe. This is what is given at the end of your book to substantiate this claim. Now, here there are two different patients. One, WC1606, has hippocampal damage. They probably have a great degree of difficulty in being able to create new memories or recall memories from the past. While patient SM046 has amygdala damage, and they're going to use this patient and try and make the claim that they have explicit without implicit memory. Now, the amygdala is highly related in the salience network. It is oftentimes talked about as something that is highly responsive to fear, but it is not actually only fear. It lights up in response to any highly salient event. Now, what you're looking at here in these two different graphs are two different sets of responses. So their fear response is being measured by galvanic skin response, and this is just measuring how much sweat is on your skin, and that is an index of how aroused you are. The explicit memory task is where they're actually asked about what it is they remember. So the way this task went is people were presented with a set of colors, so red, greens, and yellows, for example, and they paired this with an aversive sound. So let's say in this case, the sound is paired with the blue stimulus. Red, green, and yellow don't have any aversive sound. What would happen to a person like you or I in this kind of task is you will actually see, upon that blue stimulus being presented after I have formed this association, I would actually have an increase in arousal. You could measure that with my skin response, such that I would get ever so slightly more sweaty and my skin would become more conductive right as that blue stimulus is being presented to me, because it is now associated with that aversive sound. So if we go to this explicit memory section, we can see that the person with amygdala damage did a really good job of being able to respond to which color was associated with the noxious sound, while the person with hippocampal damage did horrible, right? Which makes sense. They're not able to recall or encode those memories, while as the person with amygdala damage, well, they have really no problems with their memory systems. They just probably have trouble with their salience network. Now, here's where things get a little bit confusing. Here we see that the person with hippocampal damage actually has an increase in their galvanic skin response. They're acting just like controls or healthy patients. And you see that this increases in the presence of the stimulus that is paired with the aversive sound. This would ultimately indicate that they have some implicit memory, right? So even though they're not aware of the pairing that is there, their body is still responding as if it knows that the aversive sound is coming, while the person with amygdala damage doesn't seem to show that response. Now, does that actually mean that there is no implicit memory? Or does this just mean that because the salience network is damaged, it is not causing your body to prepare to something potentially negative, and thus you are not seeing an increase in galvanic skin response? Now, here is one of those cases where confounds can be difficult, right? Now I have presented a different possible explanation for why you're seeing this difference in results, that this is simply a matter of salience and has nothing at all to do with a person's implicit memory, but rather it is just their body is not being prepared for any type of action because the amygdala is damaged, and thus you are not seeing any changes to their skin response. Sure, it's possible that it could be that they have explicit memory without implicit memory, but I find that a little bit difficult to believe, let's say. But again, those are my opinions, and if you'd like to look into this further, I highly recommend it.